Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another managerial accounting video. So exciting. So today we're going to be talking about materially over or under applied factory overhead. This is my attempt to go through materially significant. This is my attempt to go through and to give you problems. So that's more like open educational resources. However, I do ask you that if you are going to be using my content, if you want to use it, please leave me a message below. And just this presentation and content is copyright 2024 by Bennett Tchaikovsky. All rights are reserved. Another thing as well is that any opinions contained herein are those of myself and not the South Orange County Community College District or Irvine Valley College or any other affiliated organizations that I may belong to or be associated with. So let's go ahead and take a look at this over here. So when we're talking about over or under applied factory overhead, I just went through and made a video on this, that when it is not a big amount, right? So for this particular question, the cost of goods sold pre-adjustment was $2,400. The factory overhead over here was at 9, right? The amount of the over applied factory overhead. The percentage of the factory overhead relative to cost of goods sold was not materially significant. And so because of that, we just put the adjustment over here to cost of goods sold. Now, if we come over here to this example, assume that Lobo had 560,000 of under applied factory overhead for the month of June 2024. LI had the following balances. This is a very different question. And why is that? Because the under applied factory overhead was at 560. The total cost of goods sold was 1250. Therefore, 44.8%. This number is materially significant, right? This is a big number. If I put the journal entry to cost of goods sold, it is going to materially distort cost of goods sold. So therefore, I have to go through and think about what is another approach I can use with this particular question, right? I don't want to put it all to cost of goods sold because it's 44% of that balance. So what accounts should I go and put this to? If we go through and remember, right, we've got basically over here, if we think about it, right, we've got raw materials inventory, we have factory payroll, we have factory overhead, and remember actual and applied, right? Very important. This then goes, we then have our work in process, we have our finished goods inventory, and then we have our cost of goods sold. When I'm looking at if I over or under applied factory overhead, if we kind of think about it, how does this usually work? Well, we saw in the last question that we went through and did how applied overhead works is that I'm given a certain percentage, right? Overhead is applied at a rate of 150%. So here, well, I applied it at 150% of this one right over here at 150. So what happens here is once I kind of go through and apply that factory overhead, it comes over here to work in process, right? But then after it leaves, but what happens to it after that? Well, it can kind of like, or this or some of the other products it's selling can then go over here to finished goods. And then some of those finished goods that are actually gone through and have been completed can then end up in cost of goods sold. So what you're going to notice here is when it comes to raw materials, inventory and factory payroll, well, we have indirect materials and we have indirect labor that are coming out of these, right? And these are going over here to my actual factory overhead as, part of this. But when it comes to the applied factory overhead, it's not going to raw materials. It's going to WIP, in turn to finished goods, and in terms then lastly to cost of goods sold. So if the balance is materially significant, what we have to go through is we have to allocate it to the impacted accounts. And what are those impacted accounts? Work in process, finished goods inventory, and cost of goods sold. This over here, we're not going to go through and worry about. Why? Applied factory overhead doesn't end up in raw materials inventory. So when you're going through and looking at this question, right, how I try to trick you is I try to go through and make you try to allocate this to an account that it shouldn't go to. So we're going to leave raw materials alone. And in fact, we'll just go ahead and do a big strike through. How about that? Okay. Now, when we're going through and figuring out how to allocate it, because we don't want to just put it all to cost of goods sold, what I need to do is I need to do it proportionately. What does that mean? Well, I have work in process, finished goods inventory, and cost of goods sold. My work in process is 300, my finished goods inventory is 450, and my cost of goods sold is 1250. These are the three accounts I'm going to go ahead and allocate the underapplied factory overhead to. So this over here has a total balance of 2,000. So the percent of the total, right? The percent of total, 300, is 15% of 2,000. This 450 is 22.5% of 2,000. The cost of goods sold is 62.5% of the total balance. So I'm taking here a percentage of my total. You do not have to write out these computations here. I am doing this so you understand where I'm getting the numbers from. Also, whenever you click on a cell here, if you're in my class, you can go above and kind of see where I got the numbers from. Okay. So now that we have that part through, I'm going to take my percentage of my total. I'm going to multiply this by the underapplied factory overhead. My underapplied factory overhead was at 560. So what I'm going to do, AA times BB equals CC. So over here, so my allocation right over here is going to be the percentage of total times the underapplied factory overhead. And when I add up these three balance, it has to equal to the 560. So that's how I'm going to go through and do my allocation. This is going to be 560 times 15%, 560 times 22.5. This is going to be 560 times 0.625. Okay. So now let's figure out, how do I go through and basically prepare this journal entry? How do I want to go through and prepare this? So factory overhead was under applied, meaning I did not apply it enough. Okay, so we're just going to take this over here, right? So if I made up some numbers, right, and say, how could this thing become under applied by 560? Well, if I had, say, over here, 1,000 of actual and I had 440 of applied, then my ending balance over here would be 560. Again, I just made up numbers, right? Factory overhead was under applied, right? I only applied 440. My actual amount was 1,000. I'm just making up the numbers, but the under applied amount, I didn't apply enough. So I have a debit balance. Remember, factory payroll, factory overhead have to go to zero, right? We have to have a zero balance. So what do I need to do to make this go to zero? I'm going to have to come over here and credit factory overhead by 560. It was under applied. Now, I think I did another example where it was over applied. Right. So if it was over applied, in that case, I had a credit balance of 200. So I applied too much factory overhead. So I had to make a debit to zero it out. In this one over here, it's under applied, right? I didn't apply enough. So over here, I'm going to need a credit for 560. So coming over here, I'm going to credit, I'm going to indent and factory overhead over here for 560. Now, the rest of the accounts I'm going to be going through and using, well, I have my work in process, I have my finished goods inventory, and I have my cost of goods sold. So I'm going to go ahead and debit work in process for 84, finished goods inventory for 126, and cost of goods sold for 350. So coming over here, this was done at the month end or 6/30/24. My description over here for this is to basically to adjust for under applied factory overhead. That's how I go through and do the journal entry. I'm going to have to allocate the under applied amount or the over applied amount to work in process, finished goods, cost of goods sold. Why is that? When I look at these accounts, the applied factory overhead creeps in a whip, goes to finished goods, and then ultimately is going to go over here to cost of goods sold, which is why I'm doing that allocation. Now, done the journal entry, right? Prepare the journal entry in proper form, date, description. Make sure that your the account that you are crediting is indented. Extremely important for my classes. I don't ask you to do a lot of journal entries in managerial accounting, but again, something important to look at. Now, describe qualitatively and quantitatively why we chose our journal entry. What do I mean? Well, when it was not materially significant, I just put it to cost of goods sold. So what I need to say here is I need to say the amount of under applied factory overhead of 560 is materially significant to cost of goods sold, or 560 divided by 1250, or approximately 44.8% of cost of goods sold. Because, therefore, if we were to go through and make the entry to cost of goods sold only, we would be materially distorting cost of goods sold. And we'll just call this, if we were to go through Therefore, we allocated the underapplied factory overhead to the following accounts that were impacted by the applied factory overhead, or work in process, finished goods inventory, and cost of goods sold, right? That is a perfect explanation, or one that I would give you absolutely full credit for. When you go through and you're giving an analysis for my class, you have to let numbers tell your story. Do not let just, oh, it's a big number and therefore, no, 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 no. You've got to quantify it. And it's because when you're working as an accountant, you do not want to say on emotion. We're not saying, oh, we got to do that. No, no, no. You got to quantify it. Give a numerical reason as to why we're going through and doing what we're doing. So this is the other question I give from chapter 15. If something is if it's materially significant to cost of goods sold, if the underapplied overhead is material or immaterially significant, excuse me, materially over or underapplied overhead. And so that is done for today. I want to thank you for being with me. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. If there's any other content you're looking for from managerial, financial, intermediate accounting, please feel free to leave a comment below. And I look forward to seeing you on future videos. Have a great day.